G'day everyone, welcome back to the Talking Leadership podcast series. Thank you for joining me again. My guest today wears many hats, including being a ghostwriting agency owner, a best-selling author and master connector, a husband, a father, an older brother to younger men, an amateur theologian, a men's physique athlete, a voice mimic, and recovering insurance salesman. I really like that last one, and I'm going to ask my guest about that one. My guest is a first-generation Spanish-speaking immigrant to the US with African heritage and Middle East combat experience. He's lived in 5 different countries and speaks 2 languages and holds 3 passports. He does one thing well, and that's communicate with people. When he isn't writing content for clients, you're most likely to find him speaking and building relationships for his network. Can I welcome to the podcast, Paul Edwards? How are you, Paul?
Eric, thanks so much for having me. I'm doing great, and I'm honored to be a part of the show. So looking forward to it.
Appreciate you being here, mate. So let's start at first principle. So your area of expertise, and I think I've got this correct, is that communication is what drives you. So what is it about the communication process that you find fascinating?
It's a broad question. There's a whole bunch of things, but I have a philosophical bent, and I hope this doesn't bore anybody to hear this. I think it's fascinating that although all living creatures have some degree of communication, if we're talking particularly like mammals and all of that, only one uses consonants and only one thinks in abstraction out loud. So an animal, a dog, for example, can voice his enthusiasm or his hostility or his self-pity or his unhappiness, and he'll do so using primarily vowel sounds. But you'll never hear him voice his regret for a mistake he made 3 years ago using complex sentences and words. Not going to happen, right? Nor will he speak excitedly about how enthusiastic he is for his future puppies. It's not even remotely on his mind. He lacks the capacity to do that. Only we can do that. As such, to me, that indicates an advancement of radical proportions. And along with that goes potential for tremendous things that no other living creature is capable of. So it opens up horizons. And I just say to myself, what's possible when we are really good at communicating, both in our listening and in our speaking and conveying of ideas? Maybe that's sounds a little bit highbrow, but that's the first thing that came to mind. So there you go.
In broad terms, to start with, leader communication has many aspects to it. From your experience dealing with leaders in different organizations, different parts of your life, if I had to put this, I'll put this as the good, the bad, and the ugly of leader communication. Let's start at good. What does good leader communication look like?
One of the best examples I have of this is a client of mine down in your neck of the woods, as a matter of fact. I have a couple of clients in Australia. And the thing I love about the Aussie mindset, which is, I don't know if this is entirely unique to them. It's just something he's not the first person I've observed this with. And I find it much more holistic and thoughtful than maybe the way we do it in America. And that is that he was just very, very attentive to how his message could be interpreted. Not that he wanted to shy away from anything. If he had to talk about a difficult subject, he would. He was circumspect about it. He would make a really sincere effort to put himself in the shoes of the receiver of that message. I'm not saying no Americans do that. I'm just saying we can be a little bit more direct and blunt and right to it and just let it out before we think about it, right? And I'm not that way. I've made that mistake enough times and had it blow up in my face. I'm like, I'm not going to communicate like that if I don't have to. So we had a wonderful relationship working around what are all the ways that we can try and steer this message so that it's absolutely true. It's authentic, but it's also considerate of susceptibilities that people have if you word things one way versus word them another. And I think at the core, like if that's what's on a leader's heart when they're thinking of communication, they can be forgiven a lot more for mistakes they might make. Because the other thing I'll tell you is like the good, the bad, and the ugly can often be the same thing, right? It can be exactly the same phrase. It's just there's 2,000 different recipients, and half of them said, "Yep, I totally get it," and the other half are like, there's portions of people who range from "I don't understand" to "I'm offended."
Thank you for that. The interesting part of that is once the message is out in the world, you don't have much control over whether you cause offense or not. I think where you have a degree of control is that if you've crafted your message as best you can, you've been attentive to what you're saying, and you've done everything you can to deliver a considered thought. If people still take offense for one reason or another, people's subjective view of what you're saying is beyond your control, because by its very nature, being a subjective take on something it's your unique view of it. So I feel sorry when people have communication issues or something blows up in their face, because a lot of the times, at least in my experiences, it hasn't been done in bad faith. It's just potentially been expressed ineloquently, or it's been expressed very eloquently, but there's some people would consider there's a tone when something is delivered. And I find that fascinating when people, I listen to that and just the undercurrent of what was said. And I'm like, unless it was said out loud, how do you know what the undertone is if it's not expressed? And I have views on that I won't share here, because I don't want to get into the politics of communication, but enough to say that I think most leaders do their best to get out what they want done. Now, having said that, I'll get your views on this if I can, Paul. Often looking at bad communication is a hindsight thing after the fact, when things have gone wrong, rather than pre something going wrong. Do you find that in your travels that is the case?
Most of the time, though, not for the reasons one might think. It's you can look at that simplistically and say that people just blurted stuff out, right? And they don't realize it until the end. I think it's a little bit more complex than that. And what I mean is, particularly since we deal with the written word versus the spoken, right? I've pointed out to people that part of the problem with writing is, number one, you lose all of the forgiveness that you get for incorrect syntax and grammar and arrangement of the words and run-on sentences and blah, 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 right? So you can have a perfectly airtight, clean message that doesn't offend a single soul, but still throw a bunch of readers off into what is this person talking about, because you can't shut up in print, right? You don't know when to clip your sentence off and put a period or a paragraph and move on to the next thing. So it's not just a matter of, being sensitive to interpretation. It's also a matter of being sensitive to the format that you're using. You and I can see each other on video right now. I don't know if you release a video of this or not, or if you just do the audio, but there you go. There's an example, right? People can hear what we're saying. And I would argue that podcast is one of the greatest formats of that, because you take the pictures out of it, and now you can paint pictures in people's minds. But on the other hand, they might be surprised if they actually got to see the video footage of you and I talking. They might hear my voice and picture somebody who looks and emotes facially very different from what they heard on the show. And so you have to be cognizant of that. There's and then I've appeared on TV, right? And there it's all about, we're going to ask you these 5 questions in these 5 minutes, and you better have answers for them that are 30 seconds or less. And everything that we talked about in that TV interview was absolutely true to the content I was promoting, but I had nothing like the time I have on a show like this to extrapolate it and explain it. And so there, it's brevity's the soul of wit. And how do you communicate a paragraph's worth of content in a single sentence? It's just so much. There's just so much more detail to it than say or don't say.
I guess one thing that I've found in my travels is the longer you're in the world of work, or you're in a leadership role in particular, that you build skill sets around better ways of communicating. But I have to say, I think old habits die hard, because I think most of the people I've met that I would consider are highly effective leaders still have issues around listening and then being able to summarize back what they've heard. And I really believe it's a humans have a problem with this, is that you hear what you want to hear and you filter out the stuff that is not true for you. And that can have problems, I guess, because if you're in the role of leadership often, and I've heard this through the guests that I've spoken to, and I'd love to get your view on this, is that leadership is about people issues. It's not about getting things done, processes like in management. It's about people. And when you're dealing with a team, you have to accept, I think, in some critical ways, that these are people with families and issues and problems. And when you get into the personal life of employees in your team, then the sensitivities around communication come to the fore. And I think from experience, the best leaders I've met are 80% listeners and 20% talkers, because they want to help the person but not be interfering to the degree that is potentially unprofessional. Does that ring true for you, Paul?
Yeah, what I was thinking of there the whole time is that well, there is the subset there of when you're in that role, your biggest currency is not money, right? If it were, we wouldn't be having a great resignation. From everything I've heard, that's happening in Australia, just like it is in the US. It's clearly not currency. If money was the only problem, you could just raise everybody's pay and everybody be hunky-dory, but people are leaving, right? What are they leaving about? Well, they're leaving because there's a low trust environment. So I don't want to discount the importance of that, but one thing that occurred to me before you started mentioning all of the interpersonal dynamics of the families of people you're leading is also that leadership to me is there's a book called The Power of Agreement that I've heard about. And that's such a simple principle. If you think about it, when someone's communicating to you and you're in the role of the listener, to gain agreement, and yet we don't use it. And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. When my sons, who are 13 and 11 and are obsessed with computer games and video games, when they get home this afternoon, they know they're going to be peppered with questions, right? Because every day dad says, okay, so what are your first priorities when you get home? And they roll their eyes, do my homework, right? Do the chores, go play outside. I was like, yeah, okay, well, what's the bottom of the list? Playing computer games. I've learned that if I don't get that agreement from them and I just tell them no video games and go play outside, they might do it or they might not. So they trust me, but I'm not getting agreement from them. When I get agreement from them and then they try to go ahead and play anyway, and I say, you gave me your word, they back off immediately. Now, not all conversations, especially at work, are coercive or disciplinary like that. But the point is, we could get an awful lot more agreement if we would say things like, here's what you said to me and here's what I hear. Am I hearing this right? Because if they say, yes, you're hearing it right, you're hitting it on the net, hitting the nail on the head, then you're like, we have agreement. I didn't misinterpret you. I didn't take what you said out of context or skip over or ignore it or, say I'd heard it, but I was going to do what I wanted to anyway, right? It's all those alternatives that are invisible. We get that agreement. Now you're building a team because you're getting two or more on the same page about an issue to tackle it going forward. In addition, when you create those kind of conversations as a matter of routine, then the other parts of it that you're referencing there, family, relationships, dynamics, interpersonal relationships at work, all of the things that can go wrong and do go wrong, you're going to be in a much more trusted position as a leader because you actually listen and they have a track record of you listening. It's not just you listened once. It's this guy listens to me every day and asks questions and makes sure he understands me. So I'm going on a bit here, but those are the things that came to my mind when you asked that question.
In the 160 odd plus conversations that I've had doing these conversations, that it's simple to build trust, but you have to be consistent in how you do it, and being able to build that comes from being able to listen to what's happening and not necessarily say, well, I've heard you, but I don't give a crap. This is what we're going to do anyway. I think if you're going to build respect and trust and empower your people, then you've got to try and meet them halfway if you can. Now, that's easier said than done, but if leadership is an art form, and in some ways I believe that it is, you've got to be able to come to the table that way. And the feeder to that for me is being in the leadership role a reflective practitioner. And to be good at being reflective in your leadership style is to say, do I listen? Do I bother to listen to what my team is saying? And then when I do, how do I try and meet people in the middle so that we can get an outcome that we need to get? And it gets complicated and workplaces are different, but I think at the core, this idea of being able to listen is an important one. So bad leader communication, can you give me an example without giving me a name, obviously, of a time where you've seen something go catastrophically wrong and you're like, this could have been avoided, or wow, this was going to be a train wreck from the start? Have you seen that, Paul?
Oh yeah, I'll give you the name. He's me. I mean, that's the thing is like, there could be an exception to this. I don't believe great communicators are born. I believe they're made over years and years of making mistakes. There's the obvious fodder of politics and Hollywood and all of that. And those are big communication based industries. I could point to any number of things out of there, but I think I can speak most authoritatively from my own experience. One thing that I began to read, I'll give a mild one here so that nobody thinks like this, what's the matter with this guy? I used to be big on Facebook. Like I was building a big personal brand on Facebook. I was in the insurance business, right? And so I was selling car and home insurance and all of that. at first it really caught on. It was just the right time. Everybody was finally starting to get into like Facebook is just a part of life. It's 2014 or so. And I went and I had a professional photographer do a photo shoot with me in the city of Bellevue, which is right by Seattle. And it's the high rises, like a Beverly Hills type of thing of Seattle. And I started posting these pictures on Facebook, and people loved them. It was like people were clicking and responding to the brand. It was authentic to me. It was the kind of person I was, and they loved them. Over time, though, I got carried away with it. I just started doing it too much, so that people they saw it, they liked it, but they didn't interact with it. And so as a real simple example of a good communication strategy gone wrong is overdoing it to the point, there's a big question of how often do you communicate? How often do you post? How much can your audience take before you become white noise to them? The quintessential email inbox problem, if you're in the email marketing, is how frequently do I mail my list? Well, some people mail them every day and they get results every day. And other people, I'm only mailing them once a month. Oddly enough, I think some of the best questions you can ask in response to things like this are the questions of journalists, which is who, what, where, when, why, and how. But you use them in a different way. So it's not necessarily who are the people in the story. It's who is my customer, or who is my recipient, who is my audience, right? Who are they? What do I know about them? Why am I writing this message? What's the motive behind it? Where are they most likely to be open to receiving the message? Are they more likely to engage with you on TikTok, but you're over here trying to make it happen on Pinterest and nobody's paying attention? Will they be more likely to receive an email from you, but you're over here trying to do cold calls? I just took those same questions, and instead of using it to tell a story, I used it to ask a bunch of intelligent questions that I always ask before I send the message. Who's the recipient and what's important to them? And when, how frequently? When is not like, what was the date? When do I mail them? How often do I communicate with them? So
I've had that problem at a very much simpler level, not to what you've just explained here. Is when I first started doing what I'm doing, I was just posting conversations as quickly as I could get them edited and get them out. I had no structure. And then someone who helped build my logo said to me, "Oh, reaching some good people, interesting conversation. Why don't you do it monthly or fortnightly or every week?" And I went, "Does that matter?" He goes, "For the same reasons you just said. Why would you want to inundate people, get them wanting to hear more of the conversation, and sort of almost," I think he used the word drip feed. So once a week, if that's what you want to do, then do it. And so I've used the once a week model. It's created pressures for me now to make sure I can deliver weekly. And I've had a few stuff ups along the way, but I think the consistency now is building a following, and people are wanting to engage, not necessarily with what Eric Perez thinks of the world of leadership, but the guests that I can get to talk to me. And that was my aim from the start. But it took someone who had no connection to what I was doing with the podcasting to just make this very simple observation about how I was communicating. And, you beat yourself up a little bit and go, "Oh shit, why didn't I think of that?" Because your headspace wasn't there. And the one question I didn't ask was, who is my audience and how often should I be engaging with them? So yeah, point well made. Now, to bring this back a little bit to leadership, do you believe from your experiences, Paul, that communication is one of the fundamental leadership capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate, but I'd say it's probably the leadership capability, preeminent at least. And for another example's sake, I remember this story. I've heard this from a mentor of mine. Wind the clock back to 2008, 2009, the big stock market crash and all of that. And one of the big companies that was at the center of it in the States here was a company called Lehman Brothers. And I may be getting these facts mixed up. It may have been another company, but I feel like it was Lehman Brothers. And Lehman Brothers reached out to Warren Buffett, whom most everybody's heard of, to help them rescue. Now, Buffett's a rich man, but he doesn't have the kind of capital you need to single-handedly bail out a company of that size. So it can't be that they were hoping Buffett would feel like digging into his deep pockets to rescue a company that was already going under, right? So why are they going to him? And of course, if you stop and think about it, could his company take them over? Berkshire Hathaway, could they come in and buy out the company? I don't know, maybe. But Buffett's not stupid. He's not going to take over an investment that's already crashing, right? Now, certainly not by himself, not just Berkshire Hathaway. What they're instead relying on is the reputation that he has built over decades of communicating very, very well and persuasively with confidence, and not just confidence, but actual financial literacy to back it up, to show convincingly that the numbers will work out if we work together. He knows how to do that. He spends 4 to 6 hours a day reading financial statements. He's absolutely as literate as you can be in them. And he knows he can look at those key performance indicators and say, this company's going to make it or it's not. He'd probably do it in a fraction of the time it would take you and I to do it. But he has the ability to communicate that. He has the ability, and he's very, very consistent and very reliable to follow through on what he says he's going to do. And following through on what you say you're going to do, their actions, is also a form of communication. Just because it's not verbal doesn't mean it's not communication. You bring that back to, you're in a leadership position. Not everything you're doing is verbal. It doesn't mean it's not communication. And if your verbal communication is in one place and your physical nonverbal communication is in another, guess what? You're a suboptimal communicator, and the people around you are going to sense that. Whether they work under you, parallel to you, above you, partner with you, they're going to sense his word means one thing, his actions say another. His word means one thing, his tone means another. His body language is one thing, right? So, I mean, everything else is just the mechanical, right? If you happen to be swinging a golf club while you're communicating, big whoop, if you happen to be running numbers while you're communicating or laying bricks or whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is, as a leader, you're always communicating something. And the question is, are you communicating it well in thought, word, and deed?
Roadblocks to better communication. What do you think are if there's a top 3 or 4 roadblocks to being a better communicator?
Well, certainly poor levels of self-awareness is a big one. And the way leadership is evolving these days, you almost say, how can people with poor self-awareness be getting to the top, getting to the positions of leadership? But they get there all the time. It happens. It's not, if it weren't the case, I think we wouldn't have anything like the kind of societal upheaval we're having against leadership in so many areas of life. So there's a tone deafness to a lot of leaders. And, I was thinking about this yesterday. I was thinking, like, we have people, I don't know if this is the case in Australia and in the States, especially at the national level, we have people in senior leadership in politics who have been there for 5 decades. And you're like, doesn't it? I mean, what's the rub there? Why don't we have a turnover? Why don't we have a changing of the guard? And there's all kinds of reasons for it. One of the reasons, I think, is that there's just it's too easy. It's too much fun. It's too much attention that you don't have to work for. Now, I'm not trying to get into talking politics here. I'm just taking that example and saying, whenever you get into a leadership role, and I've been in a few of them, and I've even been seduced by a few of them, it's very, very easy to think I'm the man now, and people just come to me for the answers. And so life is good, and I don't have to do any work, and I'm just going to tell people what to do, and off they go, right? And it doesn't quite work that way. Not if you really care. Like, if you care an ounce about the people that are working to support you, or better stated, that you're working to support. It's harder work. It may be not as laborious. It may be not as tedious, but it is hard. It's very difficult to maintain a discipline of self-awareness and listening, and not rushing to judgment, and not blowing your top when people mess things up, and not blaming them when you failed to communicate properly. I'll give you an example of that. Recently, I lost a client that I didn't want to lose. And at first, the very first complaints that I got were around missteps that people on my team had made. But I've been in this business long enough to know that that's not really the problem, right? It's not a matter of, well, there was a typo here. Like, we never make typo mistakes because we have 3 levels of editing, but we were making them here. But that's not the problem. The problem is not the typos, right? Typos can be fixed. Typos can be reported. Hey, there's a couple typos. No big whoop, right? The real problem was that I, in the build up to this, had not really taken enough time to understand how much of a priority it was to this client to see certain indicators of growth from the content we were producing for him. And when he didn't see those levels, the other things like the typos and the missteps here and there just became added evidence for him to build his case that it wasn't worth continuing with us. And that's a failure of leadership. That's not a failure of the team. Even though they did make technical mistakes here and there, I didn't even talk to them about it. I was like, don't worry about whatever mistakes you made. We have systems to prevent us from doing that. The real problem that needs to be fixed here is me, because I took on this client and I didn't get my head wrapped fully around what his expectations were. And I took my hands off the wheel too soon. Not your fault. Buck stops here. My problem.
That's not typical, Paul. It's good to hear that you did what you did, because you could have easily turned around and said, this was the team's fault. Nothing to see here with me. And I've seen that happen. I've been on the receiving end of that when something's gone wrong. And your first reaction is not to react because you want to keep your job. But I had an incident early in my career where I did react, and there was an explosive interaction between myself and my boss that led to language that would have made construction workers sort of stop and take notice. And it was unprofessional of me, as much as some might argue it was unprofessional of the person who was leading me at the time. But being able to cop it on the chin and admit that you're wrong is not something that comes naturally to a lot of people. And if you're in a leadership role, if you're not a reflective practitioner, you won't go to the question, was it me? I think that should be the top of the list. What did I do to enable the situation? And then you kind of work down that pyramid, as opposed to starting down the bottom to look at people in your team to shift the blame to, because there's nothing more corrosive in my mind to start undermining the confidence of the people that you rely on to make your business successful. It's poison.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. And plus, like I said, right, if the situation from a growth and profit standpoint had been reversed, and every month he was, getting more followers, more sales, more appointments, and typos are coming in, he probably wouldn't have even noticed it. It's like, oh, there was a typo in this post, but look, I gained 50 followers off of it. Who gives a rip, right? I'm not even going to mention it. But it's because it was the double negative, right? Which started with me because I hadn't done my homework. And so you just have to, you got to be, I mean, yes, technical errors do occur, and yes, we have to fix them, but that's not the problem, especially from a leadership perspective. You've always got to be asking the question. And I even have an ethos for this in our agency. I say it to all of my team because they're all independent contractors. So I don't have any employees. And so I'm trying to teach them this because they're in business for themselves. But really, this is my agency. So for me, I have the saying, I am always at least 1% responsible. Even if you hold 99% and I only hold 1, I do not back away from my 1% of responsibility. Now, I'm never 1%. It's usually me 100%. But right. The point is, you yourself are 100% responsible. If we are not growing and improving and everybody's making more money and getting better and all that kind of thing, then I have a role to play. I own 50% of that, for which I am 100% responsible. And if I am down to 47% operational and you are giving, if I'm down to like 80% of my 50%, right? Everybody listening on the podcast getting confused here. In other words, if I'm not doing so well, it's going to affect you, right? As the partner, it's going to affect the client. And so I'm never totally free of responsibility, particularly since I'm the senior leader.
If you're not thinking about the business as you and the team, then you'll run into problems and taking ownership of mistakes, and you can grow and learn from mistakes. Obviously, this issue that you raised, the loss of a client, that's taught you some fundamental lessons, but it's also a good indicator for your staff that you've got their back. It wasn't about them. There's street cred and good faith building that you probably don't realize, but it's there because they've seen it now. And I don't think that's a common thing. And so more power to you, and hopefully more leaders learn from that as a lesson on how to deal with teams. So Paul, final question here, and you're probably sick of being asked this, and I'm sick of asking it, but we're in the world that we're in. Your view of communication as a leader capability pre-COVID and during COVID, do you think there's been a change? And why I ask this is the question that's come up from others to me on this, and what do I think? And I really don't have my gray matter around this as much as I should, but I am thinking about it, has the COVID process exposed bad leaders and bad communicators?
Yeah. Would it be in a pronounced way? Well, I mean, it's coinciding with the Great Resignation, and you can say that's for any number of reasons. You can't leave bad leadership out of it, is all I'm saying. It's part of the equation there. But then there's so many other things, that are the marketplace that are gradually just becoming a part of life. And I think in a way where the physical workforce world, the huge swaths of the global marketplace that didn't have to really get involved in anything online, suddenly had to get involved in everything online, and then began to see, there's this entire world of having a business. And the stuff that guys like you and I were noticing well before 2020, now everybody's seeing it because they're just online all the time and they're exposed to it. And I was using Zoom and doing digital meetings 2016, 2017, but a lot of people still weren't. Well, now even my accountant will do a meeting on Zoom, right? So technologically, it's pushed a lot of people in a lot of directions. Spiritually, and by spiritually, I don't mean religious, I just mean the invisible, all of the things that make us human, distinct from animals, and communication being a huge part of that. Spiritually, I think COVID has exposed how everybody's dark side in a lot of ways, because all of the stuff that we used to use to keep ourselves busy and distracted suddenly went out the window. And so, you hear these terrible stories about how divorce rates went through the roof and cases of domestic violence and all that went through the roof. Well, prior to that, we had all sorts of things just to keep us busy and work to keep us separate. And so it was tolerable. Then we're living in close proximity to each other 24 hours a day. Not for me, but for plenty of people. So I think it definitely did, in a way, in the sense that if you're already not paying much attention to being a good communicator with just take your family, right? Your spouse, your children, and then you 10x the amount of time you're spending around them, then you're just going to be a bad communicator more often than you normally are.
We all come at that differently. I've been in a home office for the last 7 years, so the working from home bit never really fazed me. So working from home wasn't a new thing for me. It didn't impact me in the same way. But for the friends and colleagues that I've got, family that are used to being out and are energized by people. So if I go back to that introvert extrovert continuum, I'm definitely on the introverted side of things. And so my energy comes from myself. To get energized, I go into deep thought, and that gets me through whatever the crap I need to get through to get started. Whereas others, and you probably know these people as well, maybe you consider yourself an extrovert, you're energized. And I'm saying this generically, that some people are energized by others. And when you take that away, it's like there's been a massive psychological research project here that no one's led, and we're all little test cases for how this thing was going to play out. And you make an interesting observation that is probably going to get researched at some point around just how important is the world of work to keeping society functioning in a workable way, so that people aren't divorcing, families aren't breaking down, and society isn't going to shit. It's an interesting, it's well above my pay grade, but it's an insightful observation, Paul. So look, I appreciate your time. And before we go, just again to reiterate to the listeners, Paul Edwards is the CEO and founder of the Reluctant Thought Leader. So before we go, Paul, can you give us a bit of background to what you do in that role? So over to you, mate.
Yeah, thanks for that, Eric. And the short and sweet is that we help speakers, coaches, consultants, executives, entrepreneurs, business leaders. We help them publish content, books mainly by ghostwriting. So we assist them. I also do author coaching, but we assist them in producing the content that they publish on their blog or on social media or in a book, or in many cases collateral that they publish as content within their companies, right? If they're communicating to employees and that kind of thing. And but what I want to emphasize though is that we do that, but we do it for a very particular subset of people, and they're not united, I should say, by any particular industry so much as they are by a certain mindset, a certain set of values. And they're what I call people builders. And so if you are a personal professional development junkie, right, the type of person who wants to live in constant growth mode, who cares deeply about positively impacting everybody you come in contact with, that's our kind of person. That's who gravitates towards our agency and our model.
I appreciate that, Paul. So what I'll do is I'll put a link to your website and to your profile on LinkedIn so people can do a more deep dive into what it is that you do.
Thanks so much for having me, Eric. It was great to be here.
No worries. So for those listening, this has been Talking Leadership. I've been speaking to Paul Edwards. Thank you again for your time, and we'll catch everyone on the next podcast.